Greetings to everyone on my channel once again. We continue to delve into the American space project Mercury. It's time to get to know these brave American guys who decided to go into space inside these buckets of bolts and nuts, called Mercury. Thus, in 1959, they started forming the first astronaut corps in the USA. Initially, they wanted to invite representatives of all professions associated with risk: divers, aircraft pilots, mountain climbers, even circus performers. But then they came to the same conclusion as in the Soviet Union, that the first group should consist of military pilots. By the way, for this reason, Neil Armstrong did not make it into the first group of astronauts, because at that time he was a civilian pilot. The requirements for astronauts were less than 40 years old, with a bachelor's degree or equivalent, and less than 5 feet 11 inches, 1.8 meters, tall. Well, the age requirement of less than 40 years is more or less understandable. Why an astronaut needs a bachelor's degree is not entirely clear, and the height requirement of up to 5'11" smells of pure Hollywood. That is, they wanted to put a taller person in a spacecraft about the same size as the Soviet Vostok, so that he would look good in photos. So, from about 500 candidates, the first group of 7 people was formed. The Magnificent Seven, as they called themselves. It included Alan Shepard, Virgil Grissom, John Glenn, Scott Carpenter, Walter Schirra, Gordon Cooper, and Donald Slayton. Donald Slayton was expelled from the astronaut corps in 1962 due to heart problems. However, 10 years later, in 1972, he somehow miraculously got rid of his heart problems, was reinstated in the corps, and flew, or rather participated, in the Apollo-Soyuz project. In memory of this Magnificent Seven, each astronaut gave their spacecraft a personal name ending with A7. Accordingly, the capsules were called Freedom 7, Liberty Bell 7, Friendship 7, Aurora 7, Sigma 7, and Faith 7. So, after 2 unsuccessful launches in July and November 1960, when Redstone rockets with Mercury and Atlas rockets with Mercury exploded at the start, the first successful suborbital unmanned flight was made on December 19, 1960. After this, on January 31, 1961, Ham the Chimp took off. This was a suborbital mission that lasted 15 minutes. The capsule with Ham splashed down in the ocean but began to fill with water. However, Ham was saved. Everything ended well, although instead of the expected 50 to 60 years, he lived only 25. After that, in February and March of 1961, 2 successful unmanned suborbital launches were carried out. On April 25, 1961, another unmanned launch took place, which ended with the rocket's explosion at the 40-second mark. Nevertheless, after just 2 successful launches and 1 complete failure, less than 2 weeks later, on May 5, 1961, the launch of the Mercury Redstone 3 spacecraft, named Freedom 7, took place with Alan Shepard on board. This was the first American spaceflight. The mission was suborbital, meaning the spacecraft did not reach low Earth orbit. Essentially, it was a jump to an altitude of 190 kilometers, after which the capsule splashed down in the ocean. As I mentioned, the entire mission lasted just over 15 minutes. However, before this flight, Alan Shepard uttered several phrases that went down in history, or at least they are attributed to him. The first phrase became a kind of prayer for subsequent astronauts. "Dear Lord, please don't let me fuck up." The second phrase, which Alan Shepard said, goes like, "Let's light this candle." He meant, "Let's launch this rocket already." His nervousness was due to the fact that while the mission itself lasted 15 minutes, the preparation, assembly, and launch took over 6 hours. Alan Shepard had been in the Mercury capsule for more than 4 hours by that time. He was running out of patience because he simply needed to get out for a bathroom trip. As I mentioned earlier, toilets on American spacecraft only appeared on the space shuttles, and even then, not very successful ones. Before that, they flew in something akin to diapers, and on the early Mercury missions, they didn't even have those. The Americans, apparently, decided that anyone could hold it for 15 minutes, but they completely overlooked the mission preparation time. So, Alan Shepard held on, but eventually, his patience ran out, and he simply peed in his suit, making a joking remark like, "Well, I'm a wetback now." However, this caused some concern at mission control, because the entire suit was packed with various medical electrodes reporting the astronaut's condition, and they feared a short circuit. However, no short circuit occurred, and Shepard, with a wet back, made his suborbital flight. The capsule splashed down, Shepard was successfully evacuated to a helicopter, and then both were delivered to the aircraft carrier. The next mission, also suborbital, was carried out by Virgil Grissom on the Liberty Bell 7 spacecraft on July 21, 1961. The mission also lasted just over 15 minutes. As I mentioned in the previous episode, after splashdown, Grissom accidentally triggered the explosive charge, causing the hatch to blow open and the capsule started filling with water. However, he managed to safely escape and was hoisted into a helicopter, while the capsule sank. After that, on September 13, 1961, another unmanned orbital mission took place, which was successful. Then, on November 29, 1961, the first orbital mission with a chimpanzee named Enos was conducted. The capsule with Enos successfully splashed down, and everything ended well, though Enos died a year after the flight. Some attribute this to the severe stress he experienced, but the official version states that Enos died from severe shigellosis-related dysentery, unrelated to the flight. Following this, on February 20, 1962, John Glenn made an orbital flight on the Friendship 7 spacecraft. The mission lasted 4 hours and 55 minutes, completing 3 orbits around the Earth before the capsule successfully splashed down in the ocean. The next orbital mission, on May 24, 1962, was conducted by Scott Carpenter on the Aurora 7 spacecraft. The flight also lasted 4 hours and 56 minutes. However, it is officially believed that whether due to zero gravity or the breathtaking views of Earth, Carpenter fell into a state of euphoria, used up too much fuel, and did not land as planned, resulting in a more ballistic descent. Consequently, he splashed down approximately 400 kilometers from the target and had to wait several hours for rescue while bobbing on the waves. Next, on October 3, 1962, Walter Schirra made a flight on the Mercury Atlas 8 spacecraft, named Sigma 7. The mission lasted 9 hours and 13 minutes and also ended successfully. Finally, on May 15, 1963, the last flight of the Mercury program was made by Gordon Cooper on the Mercury Atlas 9 spacecraft, named Faith 7. This mission lasted 34 hours. An interesting fact here is that, allegedly while flying over Tibet, Gordon Cooper reported seeing individual trucks driving on mountain roads and small structures and individual houses, leading Mission Control to think he was hallucinating. We will return to this fact later. After that, the Project Mercury was closed, despite the planned missions and remaining unused spacecraft. As I mentioned, all suborbital missions were carried out using the Redstone launch vehicle. All orbital missions were performed on the Atlas rocket. This is the official version of what happened in the Mercury program. Now let's touch on some oddities and points that raise questions. Many of these fall under what I call circumstantial evidence, but questions remain nonetheless. So, let's start with some technical points. Returning to the last manned Mercury mission piloted by Gordon Cooper, which, as I mentioned, lasted more than a day, only 64 photographs were taken during the flight. For comparison, during the previous mission, Walter Schirra took 56 photographs. Our German Titov, who was in flight for just about a day, brought back numerous photographs and even a short film, despite feeling unwell during the flight, as I mentioned earlier. None of the astronauts who went into orbit said anything about the stars, whether they saw them or not. This is completely unclear. By the way, this star blindness, or rather the absence of any mention of stars in orbit, will accompany astronauts for a very long time, practically until the space shuttle flights. In neither the Mercury project, the Gemini project, nor the Apollo program do we hear almost anything from them about stars outside the spacecraft. Next, let's move on to technical points. The first one concerns the fact that not a single launch during the Mercury project was filmed until the rocket disappeared from view. All of them rather quickly start to tilt towards the horizon, which shouldn't happen if the rocket is really going into orbit. We can compare this with the launches of Soviet spacecraft, both Vostok and modern Soyuz, where the rocket remains vertical for a long time and disappears in the sky, turning into a dot. With American launches, things are somewhat different. Starting with the Project Mercury, and later in the Gemini and Apollo programs, the launch vehicles quickly begin to tilt towards the horizon, leading some specialists to think that the rockets were not putting any spacecraft into orbit but were simply moving out of sight from the launch site and falling into the ocean. Then the Mercury, Gemini, or Apollo capsules were dropped from cargo planes into the ocean at the necessary intervals, after 15 minutes or several days, under TV and photo cameras, where they successfully splashed down and were delivered to aircraft carriers that were nearby. The second technical point concerns the landing of all American spacecraft, specifically splashdowns. Why did they land in the ocean instead of on land? We get two answers to this question. The first answer is that the Mercury spacecraft were so fragile and thin-walled that the designers feared they would be damaged upon impact with solid ground. Therefore, the ocean was chosen for a softer landing. At first glance, this sounds quite plausible. However, splashing down in the ocean has far more drawbacks than advantages. Firstly, why not concern yourself with building a sturdier spacecraft and, consequently, a more powerful launch vehicle? After all, this is about human safety, which shouldn't be compromised. Well, fair enough. What happened. There were specific launch vehicles and such fragile spacecraft. But again, ocean landings do not allow the direct presence of all necessary specialists and equipment at the landing site. The ocean can be stormy, it can be raining heavily. There can be a strong storm, and even in a calm ocean, as we see, a small inflatable raft with 2, at most 3 divers approaches the capsules, who in the case of an unforeseen situation cannot provide any serious help to the astronauts. We do not see doctors next to the astronauts throughout all of the U.S. space programs. Neither in the Project Mercury nor in the Project Gemini nor Apollo program were there any medical examinations of the astronauts after splashdown. Sure, they were supposedly examined on aircraft carriers, but purely for formality. Let's recall the landings of our Soyuz spacecraft. A whole host of doctors, various rescuers, specialists, a bunch of different equipment, and so on, crowd around the spacecraft. There is no such possibility in the ocean. This rather suggests an idea that perhaps they simply did not want extra witnesses at the splashdown or landing site. The second answer to why the ocean was chosen as the landing site goes like this. The USA is a country of private property, and upon landing on land, the re-entry vehicle could damage some private property. This could be a house, a farm, a car, a factory, anything. This also sounds quite plausible at first glance, but then we look at the facts. And here it suddenly turns out that the Mercury spacecraft and subsequent ones, Gemini and Apollo, had many manual control and landing functions and landed with admirable accuracy, even by today's standards. For example, the Mercury 8 and Mercury 9 spacecraft landed just 7 kilometers from the waiting aircraft carriers. By comparison, the Soyuz spacecraft even now land with an accuracy of plus or minus 40 kilometers. Accordingly, if you had such landing accuracy even back then, didn't you have enough deserts in Texas, Nevada, Alabama, or New Mexico where you could safely land these capsules? As always, there are more questions and oddities than answers. Now let's move on to the lives of the astronauts after their first Mercury missions. So, after his flight, Alan Shepard was diagnosed with Meniere's disease. This is an inner ear disorder with complications that include hearing loss and vestibular dysfunction. However, he underwent a very successful operation and later flew on the Apollo 14 mission, and not just anywhere, but landed on the moon to play golf, of all places. In other words, there wasn't a healthier person for a moon mission than an astronaut with vestibular dysfunction. Virgil Grissom flew on Gemini 3 and subsequently became a vigorous critic of the Apollo program. He did not hide his criticism and was skeptical of both the Apollo spacecraft and the launch vehicles. As a result, in 1967, under strange circumstances, he perished in the Apollo 1 capsule fire along with 2 other astronauts, White and Chaffee. John Glenn, after his first orbital mission, somehow became firmly convinced that he wouldn't be included in the Apollo program. He left NASA in 1964, became a senator, and then, while still a senator, flew on the Space Shuttle Discovery in 1998. At that time, he was 77 years old and the oldest person to fly in space. To this day, he remains the only person with a 36-year gap between his first and second space missions. That is, in 1998, he was healthy enough for spaceflight, but at 41, he somehow decided he wouldn't be accepted into the Apollo program. Scott Carpenter, after his first mission, somehow lost interest in space and took up underwater research. Initially, he trained NASA astronauts in underwater pools, preparing them for zero-G. Then he grew bored with that, resigned from NASA, and devoted himself entirely to deep-sea research. He collaborated with Jacques-Yves Cousteau and became the only person to date who has been both an astronaut and an aquanaut. After his Mercury mission, Walter Schirra flew on Gemini 6 and later on Apollo 7. Gordon Cooper, as we remember, had tripped balls over Tibet, which did not prevent him from later flying on Gemini 5. After that, he became very interested in UFOs and would tell anyone who was ready to listen that the U.S. air defense system and other systems constantly received signals from space. He claimed that aliens regularly visit Earth in their spacecraft, but the government, military, and other responsible and knowledgeable people hide this from the general public. What is the first thought that comes to mind after all of this? It seems to me that the Project Mercury already began a sort of selection process for people who were loyal and capable of lying. And lying creatively, like Gordon Cooper, who most likely was never in low Earth orbit and therefore just made up what he could have seen from space. So, he simply decided that the view from space was roughly the same as from the cockpit of a high-altitude plane. Hence, he started making up stories about trucks and small houses. Perhaps for this creativity, he was later included in the Gemini program. Alan Shepard also appears to have been loyal and thus participated in the Apollo program later. Accordingly, if there were no real missions, health wasn't a major concern. Walter Schirra also seems to have been similarly loyal. People who probably wanted to participate in real space flights and have real experiences, like John Glenn, after flying, or shall we say participating in the Project Mercury, realized that there would be no space missions for the foreseeable future and left NASA to pursue real work, becoming a senator. When the opportunity arose, he flew into space on the shuttle at the age of 77. The same likely applies to Scott Carpenter, a risky person who seemingly wanted to get the most out of life. Thus, he became an aquanaut, where he probably experienced these intense sensations to the fullest. He also seemed to understand that there was nothing to gain in space. Grissom, as we know, became a critic of this program and was perhaps removed in such a brutal way. So, in summary, what can be said about the Project Mercury? Considering the large number of failed launches, the presence of at least weak but quite real launch vehicles that, aside from the manned space program, were used by the U.S. Army Missile Command as intercontinental ballistic missiles, and considering the not very successful and apparently non-orbital Mercury spacecraft, we can say that the Americans honestly tried to create something but failed. Then they realized that they had to fake the flights. This explains the low power of the launch vehicles, the rather strange health requirements for astronauts, the lack of scorching, and the overall ability of such a riveted bucket like Mercury to fly without any issues. Again, all the accidents were related to the launch vehicles, not the Mercury spacecraft itself. After this came the idea of the Gemini program, which was even more fantastical and heroic. But we will discuss that in the next episodes. For today, goodbye everyone, until the next episodes.